Good morning.
Morning.
Can we see me on the screen? Hi. Today is the 7th day of April. I'm sure many of you are aware of what we celebrate on the 8th day of April in our school. Buddha's birthday. So this morning during morning service, we have made a very minimalistic celebration of the Buddha's birthday, where Muken bathed the baby Buddha during our chanting of Daihishu. And I do apologize that we're making such a small Buddha's birthday celebration this year. Due to my illness this week, this was not in my mind as it should have been. Nevertheless, part of the traditional honoring of the Buddha's birthday is making a sort of flower bower that arches over the Buddha. And if you wish to appreciate that, I would encourage you to go outside. It's lovely outside. The trees are doing it for us. And there are many places in the neighborhood where you can celebrate the joy of this bursting forth of spring. So, that said, today I am trying to do a Dharma talk which is about self-care. And I think it will really only work well if you are thinking along and making it personal as we go. So let's start by reading a story. I want to read you a story from Selected Teishos on the Gateless Gate. This is a collection of talks given by Yamakawa Sogen Roshi, who is currently the abbot of Shogenji in Japan. These talks were delivered at Daibosatsu Zendo many years ago and translated into English. But this is from Yamakawa Roshi. Within a year of entering Shogenji as a training monk, I had a problem in my lower back. It developed into a slipped or herniated disc. It is a very bad condition, as you know if you have ever had it. Since it is a disease inside of the bone, other people cannot feel my pain. A life in a training monastery is very tough for people who have lower back pain. Sitting zazen is the toughest. I could not sit straight because of the pain. When I was a training monk, monks then were quite rough, and they kicked others in their back or hit them hard with the keisaku, the hitting stick. Moreover, 7 times a month we had to go out to receive offerings called takuhatsu. The longest route was about 50 to 60 kilometers. We carried a rice bag that weighed 15 kilos or so on our shoulders and walked 20 to 30 kilometers. We also had to cut down trees on the mountain or do construction work. It was all heavy labor. So I was in pain during zazen, takuhatsu, and work assignment. Although I thought I was as vigorous as the others, I was overwhelmed after 2 or 3 months. I felt numb below the waist. I never had a moment's relief from the pain while sitting zazen or working. During this hardship, I had only 2 to 2.5 hours to sleep. There were 35 monks, and we sat zazen outside after the regular schedule, which is called yaza. I was the newest monk who sits on the last seat of the last row. In other words, I was the 35th monk. We would then go back inside to sleep in order, with the most senior monk going first. When my turn came to go back, it was always after 1 a.m. Our wake-up time was 3:30 a.m. Consequently, I could sleep only about 2 hours. Besides that, I was also in agony with my first koan. Because I was not strong enough, I couldn't concentrate on the koan so much. If I could have, I would be a better Osho right now. Because I was so overwhelmed, I thought about how to leave Shogenji. When I left home, I had declared impressively that I would not come back home for 3 years because I would throw everything into becoming a monk. Now only 2 months had passed, which was just 1/18 of it. If I thought about the years to come, I felt I could not endure them. But I couldn't just leave. Wasn't there some way out on which no one could place blame? A legal way to leave? I desperately thought about it. At last I found one. How about going home by ambulance? This poor man tried so hard, but unfortunately he became ill in the middle of his training. My family would accept it and maybe even praise me, saying, "You did a good job." Now, how could I become ill soon? Because I had finished only 1/18th, I wanted to become ill as quickly as possible. I thought about several ways. First, decrease the hours of sleep. Use my lower back because it is the weakest. Sit zazen twice as much. Carry 2 heavy things if others carry only 1. Visit more households during takuhatsu. So I slept only 1 hour, became enthusiastic about working, and crazily ran for takuhatsu. Soon I scarcely knew whether I was alive or dead. I thought I could become ill and go home in a week or so, but I didn't after 1 week, 2 weeks, even a month. I felt something was wrong. 3 months had passed. Well, I can tell this story with a smile now, but I was very seriously trying to become ill at that time. But human beings are incorrigible. I was sitting yaza after all the other 34 monks had gone back to sleep. I could hear the slight sound of a wall clock from somewhere. Bong. 1 a.m. I knew I could only sleep 2.5 hours. Bong. Bong. 2 a.m. And I thought, oh, I can sleep only 1.5 hours. This is the man who wanted to become ill, but still regretted that he could sleep only 1.5 hours. I was like a man in the well in the story I told you a while back, who licks honey when his life is in danger. I longed to go home right at that moment with a good excuse, but at the same time, I was aware that I could only sleep an hour or so. I felt hopeless. While looking up at the stars, I thought, I can't become ill in daytime and I can't sleep enough at night. I will never forget this. It was a beautiful moonlit night. When I finished my yaza, I was returning to the zendo to sleep, holding my cushion. It was a bit past 1 a.m., and I almost figured, as usual, that I could sleep only 2 hours. But at that moment, I thought I could sleep a good 2 hours tonight. Every other night, I had thought only 2 hours, but that night, it was a good 2 hours. The moon was so beautiful that night, and my tears came down ceaselessly. I felt I was enabled to live. Once I felt it, I realized weeds, trees, stones, the moon, and all beings made me alive. I truly realized it, and also understood the reason why I couldn't become ill. I was not being trained, but was being given opportunities to train myself. Because of this fact, I think I can still be in Zen practice even now. I've had lots of indescribable moments, and I'm sure you've had some too. So, this talk is supposed to be about self-care and Zen practice. Self-care is such a prevalent topic in this society these days. The concept is all over the place. You've heard it. But for us Zen students, there seems to be a problem. We're so often presented with stories of heroic Zen adventurers, such as this one we have just heard, who push themselves beyond their limits to attain the fruits of our school, denying themselves sleep, food, comfort, pushing themselves relentlessly. And when I think about that, perhaps there's no more quintessential Zen hero than Master Hakuin. So just to press this point one notch further, let's hear a short description of the rigors of Zen practice straight from Hakuin's own autobiography, which is Wild Ivy, translated by Norman Waddell. Hakuin talks about a particular period in his own practice. On one occasion, the two of us engaged in a private practice session. We pledged to continue it for 7 days and nights. No sleep, no lying down. We cut a 3-foot section of bamboo and fashioned it into a makeshift shipbe, We sat facing each other with the shippe placed on the ground between us. We agreed that if one of us saw the other's eyelids drop, even for a split second, he would grab the staff and crack him with it between the eyes. For 7 days, we sat ramrod straight, teeth clenched tightly in total silence. Not so much as an eyelash quivered. Right through to the end of the 7th night, neither one of us had occasion to reach for that cudgel. One night, a heavy snowfall blanketed the area. The dull, muffled thud of snow falling from the branches of the trees created a sense of extraordinary stillness and purity. I made an attempt at a poem to describe the joy I felt. If only you could hear the sound of snow falling late at night from the trees of the old temple in Shinoda. So this is our ideal of the good Zen student, right? This is what we think it's supposed to be. Sitting wide awake all through the night, finally being overwhelmed with joy at the sound of falling snow. That's kind of the picture, isn't it? Right from the beginning of our Buddhist education, we're told through the story of the Buddha's own enlightenment that we have to show no regard for our bodies or our welfare. You remember how Shakyamuni Buddha vowed to sit indefinitely until he reached enlightenment, regardless of whether his body withered away? And beyond these hero stories, we Zen people also have this conceptual paradox. If the self doesn't exist or is fundamentally not real, then how can there be any wisdom in caring for it? Right? If we've been living our whole lives inside this confined realm, which is the delusion of the self, and we're trying to break out into the wide open freedom of actual experience, then why would we want to lend any energy to reinforcing that self, to building it up, to nourishing it? And yet, we have these bodies. And they don't work so well without some care. I mean, I've been sick last week. You can still hear it. And we have these emotions and we have these psyches, and they don't work so well without some nourishment, do they? I think you can all attest to that through your own experience. So what do? We might remember some of the rest of Siddhartha Gautama's enlightenment story, which is that right before Shakyamuni Buddha became Shakyamuni Buddha, right before Siddhartha Gautama sat down and vowed to sit until he broke through, no matter what, he made the decision to abandon his routine of fasting and to accept some food from somebody, because he realized that his own body and mind had become so weak through fasting that he could no longer meditate well. And thinking about this whole topic further, some of you might have noticed the peculiar dual-edged intrigue of citing Master Hakuin as the quintessential Zen hero a few moments ago, when we were applauding the great rigors of his Zen practice. Because some of you might also know that a major feature of Hakuin's life story is his own admission that he pushed himself too hard and made himself sick. And then he spent a considerable amount of effort and time trying to figure out how to treat his own Zen sickness, how to cure himself. Because, like Siddhartha, he had become too weak to practice well. And to him, that was unacceptable. So even an ancestor as fierce and relentless as Hakuin found himself in the latter part of his teaching life, teaching specific methods of meditation for self-care, specific techniques to regain strength. And those of you who are familiar with those techniques, the Nikon techniques or the soft butter method, as it's sometimes called, it's very soft. It's very soft and gentle from Hakuin. It begins by telling you to get a good night's sleep and then to lie down, and continues from there in a very soft and loving way, right? So, of course, when it occurred to me to prepare a talk about self-care and Zen practice, what is the first and most obvious idea that comes to mind? I wonder if this is true for you also. If you say, what about self-care in Buddhism? What is the first thing that leaps up?
Pain.
Oh dear. Well, I was going to say the middle way. The Buddhism is the middle way, right? And I looked this up too. In fact, some of you may know, Shakyamuni Buddha's first discourse, first sermon, the sermon of turning the wheel of Dharma, the first paragraph, the first thing out of his mouth is expounding the middle way, explaining that his path avoids the extreme on one end of indulgence in sensual pleasure and the extreme on the other end of asceticism, which leads to abuse of the body, saying that neither of these extremes was laudable or helpful or useful, and that his path was somewhere in between. So arguably, the question of right self-care is actually the very first issue addressed by Shakyamuni Buddha when he began to teach. So as I was considering this talk, thinking of Shakyamuni Buddha and the middle way, the first story that comes to my mind, the thing that sort of settled in my mind most centrally is this. I want to share with you a paraphrasing of one of the old Pali suttas. This is a paraphrasing of the Sona Sutta, as translated and presented by Eknath Eswaran in the introduction to his translation of the Dhammapada. So probably some of you have heard this, but here it is. He entitled this short section, The Middle Path. The Buddha's students came from many different backgrounds. Ananda and Devadatta, his cousins, left behind wealth and social position. Shariputra, Mogdhalayana, and Kashyapa were ascetics, won over to the Buddha's path. Upali had been a barber. And Sona, also from a wealthy family, had entertained hopes of becoming a musician, for he loved to play a stringed instrument called the veena. When Sona took to the spiritual life, he did so with such zeal that he decided everything else must be thrown overboard. Despite wild animals and poisonous snakes, he went off into the forest alone to practice meditation, and to undo the softness of his pampered past, he insisted on going barefoot. After some time of this, the Buddha decided to go after him. The path was not hard to find, for it was stained with blood from Sona's feet. In addition to his begging bowl, the Blessed One had brought something unusual, a veena, whose strings he had loosened until they were as limp as spaghetti. He found Sona meditating under a banyan tree. The boy limped over to greet him, but the Buddha did not seem to notice. All he said was, "Sona, can you show me how to make music with this?" Sona took the instrument respectfully and fingered a few notes. Then he began to laugh. "Blessed One," he said, "you can't produce music with the strings so loose." "Oh, I see. Let me try again." And the Buddha took the instrument and wound the strings so tightly that Sona winced. When the Buddha tested them, all that came out was high-pitched squeaks. "Blessed One, that won't work either. You'll break the strings. Here, let me tune it for you." He took the instrument, loosened the strings gently, and played a little of a haunting song. Then he stopped, for the music brought back memories he was afraid to awaken. "It has to be tuned just right to make music," he said abruptly, handing the veena back to the Buddha. "Neither too tight nor too loose. Just right." "Sona," the Buddha replied, "it is the same for those who seek nirvana. Don't let yourself be slack, but don't stretch yourself to breaking either. The middle course, lying between too much and too little, is the way of my Eightfold Path." Interestingly, I looked up a translation of the original sutta that's based on, the Sona Sutta. And according to Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation, the emphasis is the opposite. The gist of the sutta is that Sona was out practicing and was finding his practice life too difficult. And the thought occurred to him, oh, I come from a wealthy family. I could quit. I could go back and enjoy the pleasures of being a wealthy person and still make merit. And the Buddha sensed this through his magic powers and then went out to find Sona in the woods and tell him, look, you have to tune your instrument just right. You can't give up the path, but you have to keep going. So, do we need to hear Eswaran's retelling because we're treating ourselves too harshly? Or do we need to hear Thanissaro Bhikkhu's retelling because we were thinking about giving up and going to get a donut? Well, either way, I think it's worth remembering that we should check the source material. Please excuse me. Neither too tight nor too loose. So if someone asks you to say something about the concept of self-care in the context of Buddhism, it would be very easy to say, the middle way, tune everything just right. And that's accurate, right? But is it helpful? Does that really tell you what to do when you're struggling? Does that really help you know how to tune your life? Maybe. I wanted to speak about this topic partly because I think it is such a hot topic in our culture. I feel like I hear talk about this all the time in some fashion. And I wanted to talk about it partly because it appears contrary to the do or die discipline of Zen. It appears contrary to these very classic Zen stories of push, 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 push. And I wanted to talk about it also partly because it seems to me very personally relevant. You may take this as you will, but in the past 5 years being here as the head monastic or whatever I am, this has been the most difficult and consistently challenging thing for me here, is to know how to balance taking time and energy for myself versus giving time and energy to the temple, to the community. Day after day, this is the question that comes up for me. I do feel naturally drawn to try to give myself to the community, try to do things that will be good for the temple in one way or another. And I also find myself getting burned out, getting exhausted and feeling sort of exhausted. That's the best word. So for me, the question is, do I say yes to any one specific of the myriad invitations here to do more, to give more? And when do I say no? When do I hold back? When do I try to rest? Will I be a bad monk if I goof off for a while? Or does my own temporary comfort have any real value in the long view, compared to the value of real practice occurring here? So for me, when these questions arise, I'm not sure if just telling myself the middle way necessarily helps. There is, however, one kind of shift in perspective that has been useful for me, and I want to try to share that with you. So, to put it abstractly, that shift in perspective is to try to look at myself objectively. Try to look at myself from some other person's perspective, some removed perspective. So we can take this from the classic Mahayana viewpoint. What is the first of our 4 great vows? However innumerable all beings are, I vow to save them all. This is kind of the number 1 motto of the Mahayana school. Well, what is the first being you encounter when you set out to save all beings? It's yourself. So to me, it's useful to try to think of myself as just another being. I'm out here with the stated mission of saving all beings. Well, here's the first being. And then I can ask myself, what are this sentient being's legitimate needs? How would an impartial well-wisher attempt to care for this sentient being? And sentient beings are different. Each one of you has unique needs. Each one of you has unique care instructions. You may know them or you may not, but you ought to know them at least as well as anyone else, right? No being is special in the sense that they require. We don't care about any being more than we care about another being, but you are equally special in the sense that you all have your own needs, different care instructions. So I think in taking this approach, it's important to be able to distinguish between our superfluous wants and the actual needs of the being. So this sentient being who happens to be you or me, what's the difference between what you think you need, somewhat selfishly or somewhat ignorantly, and what you actually do need? I can say that one clear theme of my monastic training at the monastery is that you need less than you think. There are a lot of things you want that you don't need. There are a lot of things that you are accustomed to being comforted by that you don't need. And in Zen, we often say that a good teacher will snatch away your crutches, snatch away what you cling to and compel you to learn to function without it. So here I'm recalling one of Master Rinzai's, a piece of Master Rinzai's teaching about how he deprives different grades of students of different types of attachments. Depending upon how far along they are, he will snatch away something that they are still leaning on. So, can you look at yourself objectively? Can you view yourself the same way you would view any other being? You're just one of the sentient beings out there. We try to save them all. So for me, I ask myself, if this wasn't me, if this self-care question wasn't about me, if it was, maybe a friend of mine or maybe a stranger, a random person, what would I recommend that they do for themselves? How would I encourage them to care for themselves? Do they need a donut? Or do they need to keep pushing? Do they need to go further? And if you practice the technique of considering your self-care objectively, you might stumble upon a curious question. Who is it caring for this self? The agent making this consideration is somehow not the same as the self being cared for? Who's the you there? It might occur to you that you are not yourself. What's left to be you? If anything, the you that's left is that which does the caring. So, even as I was writing this, it was obvious to me that this talk had gotten too long. But here there are only two more ideas. After these two ideas, you will likely not have to listen to me in this way for months. So the first idea, how is self-care concretized in our practice forms? Let me shine light on one example. The crown jewel of Zen practice is session, where we get together for a week and we practice as intensely as we can. From one perspective, what we do during session is just that we clear our schedule, get rid of everything else, and then we can do Zazen all the time as much as possible for a week, right? We get everything else out of the way. But importantly, we don't go all the way, do we? Because we do take breaks to eat, for one simple example. What do we do right before each meal, those of you who've done a formal meal with us, you know that right before each meal, we make an offering to the hungry ghosts, right? We pick up 7 grains of rice and we purify them over our hand, and then we offer them to the hungry ghosts. And what is a hungry ghost? Can someone explain this for our benefit?
It is a being that travels with you all the time and is never satisfied. It is said to have a huge, bulging stomach and an extremely skinny neck. It can never eat enough in one sitting to satisfy itself.
Exactly. And at the beginning of this explanation was the other part of the explanation, Shigyo pointing to himself. The hungry ghosts are us. We've all been hungry ghosts, right? We've all been in this state of experience where we are overwhelmed by our desires, where we cannot possibly satisfy our desires. And to this point, think about what kind of hungry ghosts we would literally become if we did not stop to eat during session. I mean, in a way, it would be great, right? No food for 7 days, 100% efficiency, all zazen all the time, no food, no sleep. But we would turn into literal hungry ghosts. And so these formal meals that we have, these formal acts of self-care are built into the form of session. They're built into the schedule. We all do it together. And so we start the meal by making an offering to the hungry ghost, which that's what the whole meal is. It's a little offering to the hungry ghosts. Just enough so that the desire, the hunger, is reduced long enough that we can regroup. The desire is satisfied long enough that we can remuster our energies, refocus our attention. And before we leave this topic, this idea, please notice how similar this is to what Siddhartha Gautama did, accepting that meal before he sat and broke through the last barrier. Okay, one last idea. So I asked myself, why is self-care such a big topic for this society? Why is this such a thing? And rightly or wrongly, what came to me is, I think perhaps, ironically, we are forced to think so much about self-care in the society because of a pervasive lack of other care. Think about it. How much does our society encourage us to care about others? How much in your lives are other people taking care of you? Is your family caring for you? I do sincerely hope so, but a lot of us live a long way from our families these days. Is your employer caring for you? Again, I sincerely hope so, but I think for a lot of people, that's just not the case. Like, a lot of people's employers are caring primarily about profit. Are your neighbors caring for you? Again, I hope so, and maybe they are. For each of you, you can figure it out in your own lives. But a lot of us who live in this city, we don't know our neighbors. We don't have any interaction with our neighbors, let alone caring for each other. So, who is caring for you? Your friends, your coworkers, your spouse, your sangha? Would you have to think so much about self-care if you lived amongst a vibrant network of people who were actually practicing other care? Who are you caring for? So reflecting on this dynamic brought to my mind a short piece by Peter Morin. Peter Morin is regarded as probably the ideological founder of the Catholic worker movement, which was grown and made known by Dorothy Day. Peter Morin expressed his philosophy oftentimes through the medium of these very short writings that he called easy essays. And one of my Catholic worker friends was kind enough to help me find the text of this easy essay based on my minimal recollections. Thank you, Jim. I will close by reading you an easy essay from Peter Morin, which is entitled Better or Better Off. The world would be better off if people tried to become better. And people would become better if they stopped trying to be better off. For when everybody tries to become better off, nobody is better off. But when everybody tries to become better, everybody is better off. Everybody would be rich if nobody tried to be richer. And nobody would be poor if everybody tried to be the poorest. And everybody would be what they ought to be if everybody tried to be what he wants the other fellow to be. So I do apologize. This talk has been quite a bit longer than the allotted time. So maybe we can beg the Jikijitsu to let us have short shukai before we sit. And as we'll be running late, if anybody needs to leave the informal tea, of course, you can always do that at the end of the program. Please, take good care.